Good evening and welcome to The World Today. My guest in the studio is Professor Adolph Reed, who teaches political science at UPenn, the University of Pennsylvania in the United States of America. He is an author, a powerful essayist, and has now for many years been writing about Black history, real Black history that is, and the development and weaknesses of the African American political movements over the last 3 decades and much longer. In recent years, Professor Reed has produced some incredibly powerful critiques of the way in which identity politics is being used, both by the mainstream media and, of course, by those who this is not a view that program, but tonight with Professor Reed, we have an opportunity to do so. Adolph Reed, welcome to The World Today. Let's start by discussing the decline, if you like, the political of Black Americans. What were the causes of the decline and what led to it happening in the way it did?
Interesting. Well, there's a lot there. In speaking about the decline, just to openers, I'll say the answer to that question is rather similar to the answer to the question what happened to the anti-colonial movements in the 1960s. But the problem was that the conventional understanding, for instance, is that the emergence of Black Power, and I came out of the Black Power movement as a youth, certainly, was a radically insurgent politics that was of a piece with, or at least something like a point on the same curve as the anti-colonial insurgencies and uprisings in the 50s and 60s. And in the book, I focus on two particular moments when the challenge to capitalist rule came closest to bubbling up to the surface in American politics. Moments when class became or threatened to become a general framework for understanding the character of inequality in the U.S. The two I examine are the 5 to 8 years after World War II and the mid-1960s. And one of the tropes of my argument is that in each of those instances, left insurgents or left insurgencies were defeated, right? Which is not really the big news. Everyone knows they were, and of course we lose more often than we win. I've often said to students who want to pursue left politics that you need to think like an American League baseball player, that if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you go for the Hall of Fame. But in the period after World War II, where the capitalist classes in Europe came out of World War II weak and discredited from their association with fascism, the bourgeois class in the U.S. came out stronger than ever and ironically sanitized by the role that they played in the war. So they beat us. What we got instead was the collective bargaining regime and the system of employer-provided benefits, the tremendous growth of private home ownership that was ultimately a subsidy from the federal government to the construction industry and realtors. In the middle 60s, there was a similar moment with the discovery of poverty as a special condition, and a movement further in liberal intellectual society and the policymaking world further to discredit racism, right, or racial injustice. The punchline is Black Power emerged out of a moment at which it seemed that it was clear to many people that the objectives of the civil rights movement had been won and weren't fully adequate.
Did the Black Panthers, I mean, they were one of the more interesting groups, at one stage even considering creating a larger party with white radicals. That seemed in some ways to be one of the more thoughtful and creative groups that arose in that period.
Yes, that's what I came out of. I mean, not the Panthers per se, but like that was my formative politics. Right. In fact, like I discovered you, like in the New Revolutionaries, right, like in '68. But I mean, here's the problem, right? Just as one gets older, it seems the fruit tasted better in one's youth, though it may have. The more that moment, with the Panthers in particular, seems to feel like a path tragically not taken, right? But here's the problem. And I mean, there's another conversation to have here about like a strain of historical scholarship that I think is wrong and problematic on epistemic and interpretivist grounds, but that's probably another story. But the problem is that the radicals, and I say this as having been one of them, that the radicals never really had purchase of more than a toenail, right, and a fractured toenail at that of influence in actually existing black politics. But as more and more of the radicals began to see the limitations of black power as an ideology, right, and a program, they began to undergo periods of ideological development or purification, right? But the problem was not so much how those positions differed, although we fought it out among ourselves, certainly. But the biggest problem was what they shared. And what they shared was an approach to understanding politics that did have more to do with a religion and a religious faith than it did with direct, sort of hard-headed analysis of the world as we saw it and the changes that were actually taking place in really existing black politics, right? And understanding that the project of movement building combined proselytizing, like a street corner preacher, right, to win adherents, and waiting for the moment, right, the crash, the apocalypse, whatever, right, the millenarian moment when the revolution comes, right? Even, songs of the era, when the revolution comes.
It's no surprise that quite a lot of these people ended up in the Democratic Party.
Right.
Ended up, getting, like Jesse Jackson, the best known amongst them, setting up the Rainbow Coalition. The minute the coalition collapses or he doesn't take it further or doesn't want it to be outside the Democrats, he basically, Manning Marable said this to me in so many words, effectively does a deal with the Democratic Party machine who pay off all his debts, and in return he becomes a loyal supporter of any leader. Right. So it's a sad business, and this has now become institutionalized.
Right. No, absolutely. And look, the thing that always just blew me away about the Jackson phenomenon was that there was never any doubt about what Jesse Jackson was, right? He would never have been part of organizing a genuinely left or broad political coalition, because his sole political commitment has always been the advancement of Jesse Jackson.
Yeah.
And as early as 1970, he had said he said actually that he wanted to be recognized as a new Booker T. Washington, basically, after about a year or two after King's death, which was a role that hadn't really existed, right? But so there's that. And a problem that we've had consistently, right? And I think us Altakakers have our own versions of it that are especially bad, is that not wanting to face up to the limitations of our power and influence as a left, and the kind of wishful thinking, right? I've described it sometimes as the myth of the spark, right? That some event, some personality is going to come along and presto, right? I mean, things will happen, things will fall into place. And people tend to sacralize the insurgencies of the 1960s so much now that that we don't engage in the kind of critical examination that we should as militants. And this is probably like an old man's rant, right? I mean, also, but increasingly to me, right, one of the key fault lines in sort of left of center politics is that which separates what I consider dilettantes from people I consider militants, right? And politics isn't about feeling good about yourself. Politics isn't about trying to find, an appealing history that you can hold on to in the dark night, right? I mean, people, and there may be a bit of a generational thing about this. I mean, I think people like from our era are not surprised at all about the possibility that the military is going to take power in Brazil. And we're not surprised at all, to be honest, that at the slightly less infelicitous reality that the PSUV's connections to the military are probably the only reason that they haven't been taken down in Venezuela.
The other point which you've often made in your essays, Adolf, is that if it wants to be, effectively, this is what you've said, but correct me if I'm wrong, that capitalism can be, if it wants to be, gender blind and race blind. It doesn't need any of that for its functioning. It doesn't need discrimination against women or against black people or against gay people or against anyone else. It's not capitalism that does that. In other words, these problems and discriminations can be perfectly well solved within the system. I mean, one example of this, for instance, is if you look at how gay people were treated historically over the centuries. I mean, homosexuality was illegal till the mid-60s in most parts of the Western Christian world. And today, if anyone opposes gay marriages, everyone screams at them saying, so all this can be changed without affecting how the system functions in terms of what its real needs are.
Right. No, absolutely. No, I couldn't have put it more sharply myself. And the extent therefore to which the sole actionable form of inequality that exists in either bourgeois practice or left discourse, ironically, now is disparity, right? Racial disparity, gender disparity, or whatever. Then that is at best, right, the sort of left wing, the sort of critical left self-consciousness of neoliberalism. But it's a metric of injustice that depends upon and exists entirely within the bourgeois framework. Again, as my friend Walter Michaels has put it pretty eloquently over and over again, and I quote him a lot on this, that if the ideal, the substantive ideal, right, of that perspective of social justice is that a society in which 1% of the population controls 90% of the stuff that there is to control, can be just, providing that in the U.S., 12% of the 1% are black, 14% are Latino, there's half women, and whatever the appropriate percentage of gays and lesbians would be. It's probably a myth, but there's a story I've heard for a long time that that when the Cubans came to power in the 60s, they took the philosophers out of the University of Havana and elsewhere and trained them as artificial inseminators for the cattle production effort. And I say if it's not true, it should be.
Well, I mean, the other big example, of course, is that you can get trapped. Obviously, you would agree that we defend people against all oppressions, goes without saying. That's not at issue. But the sort of movements that grew up during the Obama campaign didn't last long. The only reason they grew up is he was a pretty effective speaker, though what he said was usually quite vapid. But he was a person of color. And having a person of color in the White House, people thought on its own would change things.
Right. No, I know. It was extraordinary to watch. Right? I mean, it definitely was. I mean, I've often said that it can be more important to be in the right place at the right time and pay attention than to be smart or perceptive. And I just happened to live in that state Senate district that Obama came out of when he was emerging. So I got to see...
This is Chicago, in Chicago.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the birthing room, basically, and was close to his predecessor in his seat and was part of the negotiations about his replacement of her and the like. And it was just fascinating because, in fact, I even made a reference to it in a Village Voice article, a column that I wrote like at the beginning of 1996, and I didn't mention his name because nobody would have known him because he was nobody. But he was so obviously an Ivy League financial sector foundation world confection with like nothing there.
That was obvious even then.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, it clearly, right? And so from that perspective, like it was interesting to watch his invention. And I've often pointed out to people that in 2008, Obama got more Wall Street money than any other candidate. And they often enough look sheepish because they don't want to, because they know what the implications are, but they don't want to face up to them, right? And I mean, you remember, of course, that when he met with the Wall Street investment bankers after the crash,
they were amazed.
And he said to them, I'm all that stands between you and the pitchforks, right? And if we want to understand why Trump is in the White House now, that story and stories like that and Obama's identitarianism are as much a part of the story as anything else is.
No, well, I mean, the big talk at the time he was in the White House for 8 years was that we now live in a post-racial society. Right. And that so-called post-racial society, then it elects a white supremacist as president of the United States. I mean...
And part of the thing, too, is like the post-racialism thing. There was like no social issue, no political matter, right? No class contradiction, no social danger that academics cannot turn into raw material for their own career advancement. And it's and it's really, man, I tell you, I've been at this a long time, granted, but it just seems to get worse and worse. So the whole post-racialism thing, I mean, this is a debate that has come around like in different guises since the first waves of black elected officials started to get elected in the 70s. And when you stop and ask yourself, well, I mean, what the hell could that even possibly mean, right? So now we have the emergence of a vapid autodidact like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who sort of trades on this empty debate, and is like, and it seems to me that he speaks both to that strain of the people of color, the professional managerial class, for whom racial affront or racial identity is a form of capital, basically, and it is like in a lot of industries, as well as for those white liberals, ironically, who want to feel good about themselves for feeling bad about how bad things are in the world. The punchline is that there's no way to counter it, right? I mean, there's nothing to do except to feel bad and maybe utter Protestant moments of public confession, and then go on about your business. And, you know.
But Adolf, even you, sort of ultra-critical of many of the things going on, did get quite enthused by the campaign that Bernie Sanders waged against the Democratic Party machine. I mean, we were here watching these huge rallies, mixed rallies. Even when Bernie didn't speak, someone else spoke. She was brilliant. I mean, it's a real moment, I think, in recent American history where you feel something bubbling up.
Yep. No, I agree. And I worked in the campaign until the end, actually, and around the country. So I got to see a lot of it. I worked a lot in South Carolina, for instance. But, yeah, no, that's right. And there's something there. And I think that the big thing now should be, right, the debate for between left and right that overlaps the Democratic Party boundaries going forward. A friend of mine just sent me today a resolution that the International Longshore Workers Union just passed as an international to reach out to the 5 other unions that endorsed Bernie to begin discussions now about creating something else, right? And I understand the resolution was modified, which has to happen, but it makes a reference to the 8 unions that came together to form the CIO in the mid-1930s. And I mean, this is something that, those of us in and around the labor movement have been trying to work on for decades now. And, this looks hopeful. I mean, it's interesting to see, for instance, how the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party and the identitarian wing of the Democratic Party are coming together now. And this has been clear since before the election, to form a bloc that, among other things, is red baiting constantly, right? I mean, I was struck to see how many of them have projected like the following logic. Sanders stands for economic redistribution and calls for identification with the interests of the working class. Trump calls for catering to the concerns of the white working class. Therefore, Sanders is the same thing as Trump, but even beyond Sanders, therefore, calling for economic redistribution is by definition a cover for racism. So, but it's good to know who the enemies are, right? I mean, and how people line up.
And Trump, of course, made a mockery of everything he'd said on this question within weeks. I mean, the big thing was that I'm going to clear the swamp of Wall Street. And the swamp moved into the White House. And on many other issues as well, just shameless. Yeah. The tax cuts for the rich. So I think his time is, hopefully up if there is a candidate who can take him on. Now, do you think Bernie is going to try and get the nomination for the next time?
Right now, I think so.
You think he will?
He will, yeah.
Well, I think he's going to try, yeah. And I think the other side is already trying to organize against him. But I really think that the most important work is going to be done at the state level between now and a year from now, right? And I mean, that's where either old coalitions need to be broadened, and or new ones need to be developed, because as my old friend and comrade Anthony Mazzocchi said often, neither Democrats nor the Republicans have anything credible to offer working people of whatever genders, sexual orientations, or races and ethnicities who are becoming more and more precarious, who are suffering more and more. And in the absence of their having anything to offer, then that's a space, he always said, could be filled by forces with with a much nastier analyses and programs, and that's kind of where we are now. I don't think that winning back committed Trump supporters is a profitable undertaking. But there were between 6.5 and over 9 million people who voted for Trump who had also voted for Sanders and voted for Obama at least once. Yeah. And you've got to assume that...
This is in the Rust Belt, mainly.
Right. No, that's right, exactly. And you've got to assume that a lot of those people voted for something they thought they were going to get, which is not the thing that they got. And I think that's that's a crucial population for us to speak to. And I don't mean target like in the way the pollsters target. I mean to craft a political economic agenda that addresses them. Because what both the left identitarians, and I'll toss the Black Lives Matter people in there too, want us all to forget that blacks are disproportionately working class also, and Latinos are disproportionately working class, and women are disproportionately working class, and gays and lesbians are disproportionately in the working class. And I think that's where our focus has to be.
Understood. Last question.
Thank you very much for having me, by the way.
No, it's a great pleasure. Do you think it's possible that Trump could be elected again, despite...
Yeah, I do.
You do?
Yeah, I do. Yep, I do. I mean, a lot of it has to do with what the Democrats do and don't do. A lot of it has to do with other things that break over the next couple of years. I watched a couple of minutes of CBS Morning News today, and I saw a reporter talking to a soybean farmer in Illinois about who's a Trump supporter, Trump voter, and he's still a Trump supporter. And he acknowledged that farmers, the big generic, are taking it on the chin now, right, because of the tariff war. But he nonetheless supports Trump even before the $12 billion bailout, because he thinks it's going to pay off in the long run. But the point is, though, that the offering of empty hope, right, about payoffs coming down the road, and the classic fascist impulse of deflecting every criticism by turning it by the combination of the big lie and scapegoating. And by the way, this guy and his whole administration fit the profile of a fascist agitator with uncomfortable truth. But I think it's possible, like, for him to play this out, until after November. And I think that's partly because the liberals are looking in the wrong places for trying to challenge him, right? And that's again because they are just as committed to defeating the emergence of a political, economically grounded left as the right wing are. And I think it's more and more important for our side to take that into account too. But yeah, I think it's entirely possible he could win again.
Adolph Reed, great pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much.
Oh, it's all mine. Thank you very much, Tariq. And I trust at some point we'll be able to do it in person.
I hope so.